Imagine staring into the black abyss of the English Channel on a night so miserable. The wind is howling at 25 miles per hour, whipping the freezing salt water into 5-foot swells that slam against the steel hull of your landing craft. You are carrying 80 pounds of gear, packed shoulder to shoulder, with 30 other men in a flat-bottomed boat that feels more like a floating coffin than a tactical vehicle. The temperature is hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but the chill sinking into your bones has nothing to do with the weather. Across 21 miles of choppy water lies the most heavily fortified coastline in human history, bristling with concrete, barbed wire, and thousands of machine guns zeroed in on the exact patch of sand you are ordered to walk onto. 156,000 men are about to be hurled into this meat grinder. There is no margin for error, no fallback position, and no alternative to absolute victory. You either break the Atlantic Wall or you die trying. Welcome to the brutal mathematics of Operation Overlord. If you want to understand the cold, hard truths of military strategy, how empires clash, and how the bloodiest battles in history were actually won on the drawing board before a single shot was fired, you are in the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our ranks as we dissect the mechanics of war. Let us know in the comments down below which military operation you want us to tear apart next. To understand the sheer scale and the strategic desperation of D-Day, we cannot just look at the morning of June 6, 1944. We have to rewind the clock and look at the geopolitical nightmare the Allies were staring down. By late 1943, Adolf Hitler's fortress Europe was a monolithic block of occupied territory stretching from the Pyrenees in the west to the blood-soaked plains of the Soviet Union in the east. The strategic reality was simple and terrifying. The Soviet Red Army was bleeding the German Wehrmacht dry on the Eastern Front, absorbing millions of casualties in a war of annihilation. Premier Joseph Stalin was screaming for a second front in Western Europe to relieve the pressure on his forces. The Western Allies knew that if they did not punch a hole into France and drive on Berlin, one of two disastrous things would happen. Either the Soviet Union would collapse, freeing up hundreds of German divisions to turn west and make an invasion of Europe mathematically impossible, or worse, the Soviets would win on their own and march all the way to the English Channel, painting the entire European continent red. The invasion was not just about liberating France. It was a race for the geopolitical survival of the post-war world. But launching an amphibious assault across the English Channel is not like crossing a river. It is a logistical nightmare that makes the Union Army's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War look like a backyard camping trip. In the Civil War, General Winfield Scott realized you had to strangle the Confederacy by blockading its ports and controlling the Mississippi River, starving the enemy of resources. The Allies had to do the exact opposite. They had to take an island nation, Great Britain, and turn it into the largest unsinkable aircraft carrier and forward supply base in human history, while German U-boats prowled the Atlantic trying to sever the supply lines. This effort was called Operation Bolero. Between 1942 and 1944, the industrial might of the United States shifted into a gear the world had never seen. The Detroit arsenal and factories across the American Midwest pumped out steel, munitions, and vehicles at a staggering rate. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that were welded together in as little as 4 days, hauled 17 million tons of cargo across the Atlantic. We are talking about 2 million troops, aircraft, locomotives, millions of gallons of fuel, and enough rations to feed a medium-sized country. Southern England became so packed with American tanks, artillery, and men that soldiers joked. The only thing keeping the island from sinking into the ocean was the barrage balloons tied to the ground. Amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. You cannot put 156,000 men on a hostile beach without feeding them, arming them, and fueling their vehicles. And here is the kicker. The Allies knew that once they landed, they would not immediately have access to a major deep-water port. The Germans were not stupid. They knew the Allies needed a port like Cherbourg or Le Havre to unload the heavy armor and supplies required to sustain an inland drive. So, the German strategy was to heavily defend those ports and rig them for demolition. The Allied solution to this was a stroke of absolute engineering madness. If we cannot capture a port, we will bring our own. They designed and built the Mulberry Harbors, massive artificial ports, made of hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and steel, towed across the English Channel in pieces and assembled off the coast of Normandy. They also laid a pipeline under the ocean, known as PLUTO, to pump thousands of gallons of fuel directly from England to the French coast. This level of logistical preparation was unprecedented. It was the industrial equivalent of moving the entire city of Chicago across a hostile ocean in a single night. Let us look at the opposing forces, starting with the defenders. The German defense of Western Europe was under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a Prussian aristocrat and a veteran of the old school of mobile warfare. But the man actually tasked with fortifying the beaches was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel took one look at the Atlantic Wall in early 1944 and realized it was a propaganda myth. It was incomplete, undermanned, and structurally flawed. Rommel went into a frenzy of construction. He poured millions of tons of concrete, laid over 6 million landmines, and installed millions of obstacles on the beaches. We are talking about Belgian gates, steel tetrahedrons, and wooden stakes topped with teller mines, designed specifically to rip the bottoms out of flat-bottomed landing craft at high tide. Rommel understood something fundamentally crucial about Allied air superiority. If the Allies got a foothold on the beach, German armor would never be able to move in daylight to push them back into the sea. Allied fighter bombers, the P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons, would chew them to pieces. Therefore, Rommel argued the invasion had to be stopped at the water's edge. The beaches had to be the main line of resistance. Von Rundstedt vehemently disagreed. He believed that stopping a massive naval bombardment and amphibious assault on the beach was impossible. He wanted to hold the elite panzer divisions in reserve, deep inland, out of the range of Allied naval guns. His doctrine was defense in depth. Let the Allies land, let them stretch their supply lines, and then hit them with a massive, coordinated armored counterattack to crush them against the sea. This doctrinal clash between Rommel and Rundstedt created a fatal compromise. Adolf Hitler, playing the two generals against each other, decided to split the armored reserves. He gave some to Rommel, kept some for Rundstedt, and held the most powerful panzer divisions in a strategic reserve under his own personal command, meaning they could not be moved without Hitler's explicit order. This violation of the principle of unity of command would cost the Germans dearly. Now, let us examine the firepower these two sides were bringing to the fight. The backbone of the German beach defense was the wider stance nest or resistance nest. These were interconnected networks of concrete pillboxes, trenches, and mortar pits. The concrete on these bunkers was often reinforced and up to 6 feet thick, impervious to anything but a direct hit from a massive naval shell. Inside these bunkers sat the MG-42 machine gun. This weapon was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, firing a 7.92 mm round at an astonishing rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. That is 20 bullets leaving the barrel every single second. The sound it made was not a rat-tat-tat, but a terrifying tearing canvas sound. It was nicknamed Hitler's Buzzsaw. The Americans facing this would be armed primarily with the M1 Garand. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he was not far off. It was a semi-automatic rifle firing a heavy .30 caliber round, giving the individual American infantryman a significantly higher rate of aimed, accurate fire compared to the German infantryman, who was still largely equipped with the bolt-action Karabiner 98K. But a rifle, no matter how good, does not win an argument with a concrete bunker and an MG-42. To crack those bunkers, the Allies needed armor on the beach. Here we see another stark contrast in military doctrine. The German armored philosophy, by 1944, was focused on heavily armed beasts like the Panther and the Tiger tanks. The Tiger weighed nearly 60 tons and mounted a lethal 88 mm gun that could punch through an American tank from a mile away. But they were over-engineered, difficult to maintain, and guzzled fuel that the Germans simply did not have. The American approach was the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was not the best tank in a one-on-one duel with a Panther, but war is not a jousting match. The Sherman was a triumph of mass production and logistical efficiency. It was reliable, easy to repair, and most importantly, it fit perfectly into the cargo hold of a Liberty ship. You could ship thousands of them across the ocean. Quantity has a quality all its own. But standard tanks sink in water. The Allies learned a brutal lesson in 1942 during the disastrous Dieppe raid, where Canadian forces were slaughtered trying to assault a fortified French port without proper armored support or specialized equipment. It was a miniature Gallipoli, echoing the catastrophic British amphibious failure in World War I, where thousands of Anzac troops were pinned down on a Turkish beach and bled white because they lacked the firepower and mobility to push inland. The Allies were not going to repeat Gallipoli, and they were not going to repeat Dieppe. The British developed a series of specialized armored vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies. There were tanks designed to flail the ground with heavy chains to clear landmines, tanks that carried massive fascines to drop into anti-tank ditches, and most critically for D-Day, the duplex drive, or DD tank. This was a standard Sherman tank fitted with a collapsible canvas screen and twin propellers. The idea was to launch them from landing craft a few miles offshore, allowing them to swim to the beach and provide immediate heavy fire support for the infantry the moment they hit the sand. It was a brilliant concept on paper, assuming the water was relatively calm. The intelligence picture was also a critical battlefield. The Allies executed Operation Fortitude, the greatest Decoding campaign in military history. They created an entire Ghost Army, the first U.S. Army group, commanded by the man the Germans feared most, General George S. Patton. They built inflatable rubber tanks, fake wooden aircraft, and generated thousands of fake radio transmissions to convince the German High Command that the real invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The deception was so effective that the German 15th Army, boasting hundreds of thousands of men and vital panzer divisions, sat parked in the Pas de Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. They were looking the wrong way. But even with the deception, the forces waiting at Normandy were lethal. Allied intelligence had identified the defenders at Omaha Beach, the primary American landing zone, as the 716th Static Infantry Division. These were supposed to be second-rate troops, older men, conscripts from occupied territories, lacking heavy weapons and the will to fight. It was a fatal miscalculation. Secretly, the Germans had moved the 352nd Infantry Division into the Omaha sector. These were battle-hardened veterans who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. They knew how to fight, they knew how to kill, and they were dug into the bluffs overlooking the beach with overlapping fields of fire. Is it possible to plan a perfect military operation? History tells us no. War is a living, breathing entity governed by chaos and friction. You can map out every bunker, count every bullet, and train every soldier, but the moment the first ramp drops, the plan goes out the window. The Allies had amassed the greatest armada ever seen. 7,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and an industrial supply chain stretching all the way back to the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of California. The strategic chessboard was set. The deception had worked. The troops were briefed, their faces painted with cork, their stomachs churning with a mix of fear and seasickness. Everything was in place to unleash hell on the coast of Normandy. But all the steel, all the planning, and all the logistical miracles in the world were about to collide with the brutal, unforgiving reality of a stormy sea, a fortified beach, and a determined enemy waiting in the dark. The vanguard of this colossal invasion did not arrive on boats but fell from the midnight sky. Hours before the first landing craft hit the sand, 24,000 Allied paratroopers were hurled into the darkness over Normandy. The American airborne element, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, were tasked with a seemingly impossible mission. They had to secure the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and destroy the bridges over the Douve River to prevent German armor from rolling down and crushing the beachhead. They flew in C-47 Skytrain transport planes, flying in tight V formations at a painfully slow 110 miles per hour, completely blacked out. The men inside were weighed down with upwards of 120 pounds of gear. They carried the M1A1 folding stock carbine, the legendary Thompson submachine gun firing a heavy .45 caliber man-stopping round, anti-tank mines, medical kits, and enough ammunition to fight isolated for 3 days. But the meticulously planned drop zones evaporated the moment the planes hit the French coast. A massive cloud bank obscured the ground, and German anti-aircraft fire, the dreaded flak, erupted into the sky. Panic set in among the transport pilots. They broke formation, diving and accelerating to evade the explosive shrapnel tearing through their aluminum fuselages. When the green jump lights finally flashed, the paratroopers were scattered across hundreds of square miles of the Cotentin Peninsula. How do you fight a cohesive battle when your entire division is scattered to the wind like confetti? You improvise. The situation on the ground mirrored the chaotic, blind engagements of the Battle of the Wilderness during the American Civil War, where Union and Confederate troops stumbled into each other in dense, burning woods, reducing grand strategy to vicious, squad-level fights. The American paratroopers found themselves alone, lost in the flooded fields and high hedgerows of Normandy, armed with nothing but their rifles and a small, 10-cent brass toy called a cricket clicker used for identification in the dark. One click to be answered by two. If you heard the metallic bolt of a German Mauser rifle instead, you fired first. This massive scattering of airborne troops, initially seen as a catastrophic failure, inadvertently became a brilliant tactical advantage. The German High Command was receiving desperate reports of paratroopers landing everywhere, from actual drop zones to the roofs of their own command posts. The sheer chaos paralyzed the German response, making them believe the airborne assault was 10 times larger than it actually was. While the paratroopers fought their isolated shadow war in the Bocage, the greatest naval armada in history dropped anchor off the coast. At 0530 hours, the naval bombardment commenced. Battleships like the USS Texas and the USS Arkansas unleashed their 14-inch guns, hurling 2,000-pound high-explosive shells at the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall. The sky turned a violent shade of orange. But did this apocalyptic display of firepower actually neutralize the German defenses? Not even close. The naval gunners, terrified of dropping short and hitting their own incoming landing craft, overcompensated. The vast majority of the heavy naval shells and the bombs dropped by the heavy B-17 flying fortresses sailed harmlessly over the coastal bluffs, obliterating empty cow pastures miles inland. The concrete resistance nests on Omaha Beach were left virtually untouched, their MG-42 machine guns fully operational and waiting. The plan called for armor to lead the infantry onto the beaches. This was the moment for the duplex-drive Sherman tanks we discussed earlier. At Omaha Beach, 29 of these amphibious tanks were launched from landing craft tank vessels 3 miles offshore. It was a death sentence. The canvas flotation screens were designed to handle waves no higher than 1 foot. The English Channel was violently churning with 5 to 6 foot swells. Water immediately swamped the engine compartments. One by one, 27 of the 29 30-ton tanks sank like stones to the bottom of the channel, taking their crews down with them. The infantry was now going in naked, stripped of the heavy fire support that was supposed to crack the concrete bunkers. At 0630 hours, H. Hauer, the first wave of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions approach Omaha Beach in flat-bottomed Higgins boats. The Higgins boat, officially the LCVP, was a marvel of utilitarian design, built largely of marine plywood with a steel ramp at the front. It could carry 36 fully equipped men right up to the shoreline. But that steel ramp was a fatal funnel. As the boats ground to a halt on the sandbars, the ramps dropped, exposing the packed men directly to the pre-sighted, overlapping fields of fire from the German bunkers on the bluffs above. The ensuing slaughter was a horrific echo of the Battle of Tarawa in the Pacific just a year prior, where U.S. Marines were stranded on coral reefs and forced to wade through hundreds of yards of waist-deep water under relentless Japanese machine gun fire. At Omaha, the Americans faced a similar nightmare. Men leaped from the ramps into water over their heads, dragged under by the weight of their sodden gear. Those who made it to the shallows were cut to pieces by the enfilading fire of the MG-42s. The topography of Omaha Beach was a defender's dream. A crescent-shaped stretch of sand, bounded by cliffs at both ends, rising to a 150-foot bluff. The only ways off the beach were 5 narrow ravines, known as draws, heavily mined and choked with concrete anti-tank walls. The beach itself was a kill zone, littered with the steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes Rommel had meticulously placed. Within the first hour, the American assault completely disintegrated. Units were mixed up, officers and non-commissioned officers were disproportionately wiped out by German snipers, who were trained to target the men waving their arms and shouting orders. The survivors huddled behind the meager cover of the seawall, a small lip of shingle stones at the high tide mark, paralyzed by the sheer volume of lead tearing the air apart inches above their heads. The situation was so desperate that Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces from the cruiser USS Augustus, seriously considered pulling the plug on Omaha and diverting the follow-up waves to Utah Beach or the British sectors. 4 miles to the west of Omaha, an even more audacious assault was unfolding at Point du Hoc. This was a jagged promontory jutting out into the channel, topped by 100-foot vertical cliffs. Allied intelligence confirmed that the Germans had installed a battery of 6 155mm artillery pieces on this point. These guns had the range to drop high explosive death on both Omaha and Utah beaches simultaneously. They had to be silenced. This suicidal task fell to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder. The Rangers approached the cliffs in British-made LCA landing craft under heavy fire and fired rocket-propelled grappling hooks attached to ropes and rope ladders to the top of the cliff. Imagine trying to climb a wet, muddy rope dangling over a 100-foot drop, while German soldiers lean over the edge, dropping potato masher grenades and cutting the ropes with bayonets. It is a scenario that defies tactical logic. Yet, within 30 minutes, the Rangers scaled the cliffs, fighting hand-to-hand, clearing the trench networks with Thompson's submachine guns, fragmentation grenades, and sheer, raw aggression. But when they reached the massive concrete casemates, they found them empty. The Germans, anticipating a bombing raid, had moved the heavy guns inland. Did the Rangers pack up and go home? No. They pushed south, located the hidden guns camouflaged in an apple orchard, and destroyed their firing mechanisms with thermite grenades, neutralizing the greatest artillery threat to the American beaches. They then dug in and held their ground against furious counterattacks by the German 914th Grenadier Regiment for 2 agonizing days. Back on the bloody sands of Omaha, survival came down to the initiative of small groups of men and the reckless bravery of the United States Navy. Seeing the infantry pinned down and being systematically slaughtered, the commanders of several destroyers, including the USS Carmack and the USS Frankfurt, made a command decision that ignored every rule in the naval handbook. They ordered their ships to close with the beach, risking running aground in the shallows. They brought their 5-inch guns to bear on the German pillboxes at point-blank range, sometimes as close as 800 yards from the shore. This direct, flat trajectory fire began to systematically blast the concrete resistance nests into dust, relieving the pressure on the pinned-down infantry. On the beach, leadership emerged from the carnage. Brigadier General Norman Cota, the assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry Division, strode up and down the shingle under heavy fire, a cigar in his mouth and a Colt .45 in his hand. He famously told the Rangers of the 5th Battalion that Rangers lead the way, and bluntly informed his men that there were only 2 kinds of people on that beach, the dead and those who were going to die, so they might as well get the hell out of there and kill some Germans. Men began to snap out of their shell shock. They used Bangalore torpedoes, essentially long metal tubes packed with TNT, to blast holes through the coils of concertina wire blocking the base of the bluffs. Small groups of riflemen, armed with Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garands, began to infiltrate up the steep, brush-covered slopes between the heavily defended draws. They bypassed the strongpoints, got behind the German bunkers, and cleared them out with grenades and flamethrowers from the rear. By midday, the tide at Omaha had finally turned. The brutal, agonizing crawl up the bluffs had succeeded, but the cost was staggering. Over 2,400 American casualties littered the sand and floated in the crimson tide. The Atlantic wall had been breached, but the beachhead was incredibly fragile, barely a mile deep in some places. The men on the ground were exhausted, low on ammunition, and missing their heavy armor. They had survived the water's edge, but the real test of operational endurance was only just beginning. As the sun began to set on the longest day, the surviving infantrymen looked toward the dense, impenetrable hedgerows of the Normandy countryside, knowing that the elite German panzer divisions and beasts of the Wehrmacht were finally waking up and moving toward the coast to push them right back into the sea. The sun dipped below the horizon on June 6th, casting long dark shadows over a beachhead that was little more than a bleeding toehold on the edge of a hostile continent. The American infantrymen, exhausted, soaked in seawater, and the blood of their friends, looked inland and realized the nightmare was far from over. Waiting for them just beyond the coastal bluffs was the Norman Bocage. If you look at a map of Normandy, it looks like a picturesque patchwork quilt of quaint farm fields. On the ground, it is a tactical hellscape. These hedgerows were not decorative garden bushes. They were earthen embankments, 4 to 6 feet thick and up to 10 feet high, built up over 1,000 years by French farmers piling rocks, dirt, and thick, thorny vegetation to mark property lines. They formed a massive, interconnected labyrinth of natural fortresses, turning every single cow pasture into a heavily fortified kill zone. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see until you are 10 feet away? You do not outmaneuver them because you cannot move. You have to grind them into the dirt one bloody yard at a time. Fighting in the Bocage was a brutal, claustrophobic nightmare that closely mirrored the suffocating jungle combat American troops would later face in the Ia Drang Valley of Vietnam, or the savage, inch-by-inch island-hopping campaigns against deeply entrenched Japanese defenders on Peleliu and Okinawa. In all these environments, superior American mobility and long-range firepower were completely negated by terrain that allowed a numerically inferior defender to dictate the terms of engagement. The Germans adapted to the hedgerows with terrifying efficiency. They dug their MG-42 machine guns into the bottom corners of the earthen banks, creating interlocking fields of crossfire that swept the open fields at knee height. They pre-sighted their 81mm mortars on the only gaps in the hedges, waiting for American platoons to bunch up before dropping high explosives directly on their heads. The American M4 Sherman tank, the workhorse of the armored divisions, was nearly useless in this environment. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, its nose would point straight up into the sky, exposing the thinly armored underbelly of the tank to German anti-tank weapons. The Germans were waiting with the Panzerfaust, a cheap, disposable, shoulder-fired recoilless anti-tank weapon that fired a shape-charge warhead capable of burning a hole straight through a Sherman's steel hull, turning the interior into a localized crematorium. The American advance ground to a bloody, agonizing halt. But this is where the American military doctrine of bottom-up tactical innovation saved the campaign. A young sergeant named Curtis Coulin, serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, came up with a brilliantly savage idea. He took the steel beams from the German beach obstacles Rommel had planted on the sand, cut them up with welding torches, and welded them to the front of the Sherman tanks like massive steel tusks. These modified beasts, nicknamed Rhino tanks, no longer climbed over the hedgerows. They violently rammed their way straight through the earthen banks, bursting through the dirt and roots, with their 75mm guns leveled and firing, completely shocking the German defenders. It was a triumph of field engineering that fundamentally altered the tactical geometry of the battlefield. While the infantry bled in the hedgerows, the strategic threat of a massive German armored counterattack loomed over the entire operation. Why did the elite panzer divisions not immediately crush the fragile Allied beachhead on June 7th or 8th? The answer lies in the sky. The Allies possessed absolute, uncontested air supremacy. The United States Army Air Forces unleashed fleets of P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons. The Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug, was a massive 7-ton fighter bomber, powered by a 2,000-horsepower radial engine. It was armed with 8 50-caliber machine guns and could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or 5-inch high-explosive rockets. To the German panzer commanders on the ground, the Thunderbolt was the angel of death. Any German tank, truck, or troop column that dared to move on the roads of Normandy during daylight hours was immediately spotted and relentlessly strafed, bombed, and rocketed into burning scrap metal. The mighty German Panther and Tiger tanks, with their heavy armor and lethal high-velocity guns, were effectively paralyzed. They were forced to hide in the woods during the day and creep toward the front lines only under the cover of darkness, burning precious fuel and arriving piecemeal, exhausted, and disorganized. But air supremacy and tactical grit mean absolutely nothing if you cannot feed the beast of war. Let us shift our focus to the multidimensional reality of this campaign, starting with logistics. The sheer scale of consumption on the Normandy beachhead defies human comprehension. A single American infantry division in combat consumed roughly 600 tons of supplies every single day. Multiply that by the dozens of divisions pouring into France, and you have a logistical math problem that would break the minds of most civilian supply chain managers. The artificial mulberry harbors we discussed earlier were critical, but on June 19th, a massive unseasonal storm ripped through the English Channel, completely destroying the American mulberry at Omaha Beach and severely damaging the British one at Gold Beach. Did the invasion starve? No. The United States Navy simply ordered the captains of the massive LSTs, the landing ship tanks, to intentionally run their 300-foot steel vessels aground directly onto the sandy beaches as at high tide, unload their cargo directly onto the shore as the tide went out, and float back off on the next high tide. It was an improvised, brute force solution that actually increased the daily tonnage of supplies being offloaded. Once the combat engineers blew a hole in the German lines during Operation Cobra in late July, allowing General George S. Patton's Third Army to break out of the Bocage and across the French countryside, a new logistical crisis emerged. Patton's Sherman tanks were burning hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline a day, and they were outrunning their supply lines. To keep the armor moving, the Allies created the Red Ball Express. This was a massive loop-in, one-way highway system stretching from the beaches of Normandy deep into France, dedicated entirely to supply trucks. Nearly 75% of the drivers on the Red Ball Express were African-American soldiers serving in segregated quartermaster units. Driving heavily loaded 2.5-ton trucks, known as the Deuce and a Half, they drove day and night, bumper to bumper, at high speeds, often under the threat of German sniper fire and strafing aircraft. They moved an astonishing 12,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel to the front lines every single day. This logistical leviathan stands in stark contrast to the starvation and supply chain collapse suffered by George Washington's Continental Army at Valley Forge, proving that in modern mechanized warfare, the quartermaster driving a truck is just as strategically vital as the infantryman pulling a trigger. From an intelligence and political perspective, the Shadow War continued to paralyze the German High Command. The Operation Fortitude Deception campaign was so incredibly successful that Adolf Hitler absolutely refused to release the massive German 15th Army, which was sitting idle in the Pas-de-Calais region, hundreds of miles away from Normandy. Even weeks after D-Day, Hitler remained convinced that the Normandy landings were merely a diversionary tactic, and that the real invasion, led by the Phantom Army of General Patton, was still coming. By the time German military intelligence realized they had been duped, the Allies had already landed over 1 million men and hundreds of thousands of vehicles in France. The window for a decisive counterattack had slammed shut. Economically, the Battle of Normandy exposed the fatal flaw in the fascist war machine. Germany was fighting a multi-front war of attrition with a heavily bombed industrial base that relied on slave labor and convoluted, over-engineered weapons designs. The United States, meanwhile, was an untouched industrial juggernaut operating at peak efficiency. American factories were churning out a new B-24 heavy bomber every 60 minutes and a new Sherman tank every few hours. When a German Tiger tank broke down in Normandy, it often had to be abandoned and blown up by its own crew because spare parts simply did not exist. When an American Sherman tank was destroyed, another one was rolling off a Liberty ship the very next morning to take its place. You cannot win a war of attrition against an enemy whose gross domestic product is weaponized to a degree that defies economic gravity. In the final analysis, Operation Overlord was not just a military battle. It was a hostile, mechanized corporate takeover of a continent, funded by the limitless industrial capacity of the American economy, orchestrated by brilliant logistical minds, and paid for in blood by the teenage boys from the farms of Iowa and the streets of Brooklyn who charged out of those landing craft into a wall of machine gun fire. D-Day proved that a free society, when pushed to the brink of annihilation, can mobilize its resources, innovate under fire, and unleash a storm of steel that no dictatorship on earth can withstand. The Atlantic Wall was broken, the liberation of Europe had begun, and the Thousand-Year Reich was placed on a one-way collision course with total destruction. The true cost of freedom is rarely measured in dollars. It is measured in the cold, brutal mathematics of human sacrifice, paid in full on a stretch of French sand that will forever belong to the men who took it. Now we want to hear from you. Which factor do you believe was the most critical to the ultimate success of the Normandy invasion? A. The overwhelming Allied industrial and logistical superiority. B. The brilliant Operation Fortitude deception campaign that paralyzed the German command. Or C. The tactical adaptability and raw courage of the individual soldier fighting on the ground. Let us know your choice and your reasoning in the comments below.